a bunch of examples here. Let's see here. So it does not look like I have an RPA, but that's okay. I can draw. So the let's blow these up and look at these because these will be helpful. When you do your drawings, I mean, if I think this is a really good study guide to use for your exam, because when you draw your designs for Dr. Lai, you're going to be held to the information that is on here. So a couple things to remember. With a cast circumferential, the retentive arm comes from above the undercut and the terminal third dips in. So these little dash lines on this drawing are a survey line. Notice that our clasp arm on the, so this is the retentive side, this is the reciprocating side. It comes off the guide plate and it starts above the undercut and only the terminal third dips into the undercut. The entire reciprocating arm is above the survey line. Your reciprocating arm should not dip down into the survey line. So if you happen to have this out, designate this is reciprocating arm and this is retentive arm. So you need to make sure when you do your drawings for Dr. Lai that you follow those criteria. So here's a design from my class. You can see that the lead pencil line is my survey line, and we have chosen to do a cast circumferential on tooth number 2. So my reciprocating arm is completely above my pencil line. It's also not sloppily drawn, it's not overly thick, it's not scratched in there, it's drawn very, very neatly, all right? My retentive arm on the buckle comes off of my plate, it's above the survey line, and the terminal third dips in. So it's very important that you understand that. When you draw these for your exam, if you happen to have to draw a cast circumferential, you want to pay attention to those things. The reason that you need a retentive arm and a reciprocating arm is that the retentive arm engages and puts pressure on the tooth, and the reciprocating arm resists the pressure from the retentive arm and keeps the tooth from moving orthodontically. So when this class functions, the retentive arm puts a little pressure on the tooth as it engages and holds the partial end, and the reciprocating arm resists that force and keeps the tooth from being shifted palatally. Does that make sense to you? All right? You guys are so quiet. Okay. Should I keep going? All right, making sense to you? Okay. All right. So that's the cast circumferential class. Let's go down now here and look at the I-bar. So if you happen to have to choose an I-bar for next week, you want to make sure that you follow the drawing here. So with the I-bar, it's going to, let me go back to one of my choices here. I can show you. Okay. So the I-bar is going to come off the horizontal strut. It's going to come down and it's going to engage the undercut. You're going to need 010 in the mid buckle or the mesio buckle. So you want to make sure that, again, when you draw this, I don't have a good drawing of an I-bar, but this is actually a really good design if you want to picture this kind of drawn in green. So again, off of the first horizontal strut. So if I had this, so in my drawing here, here's my first horizontal strut. Let's say I was doing an I-bar here. My I-bar would come off of the first horizontal strut. We'll ignore the tissue undercut here. And this is going to be my approach arm. So my approach arm is going to approach from that. Oh, sorry guys, sorry, thank you. I need somebody here to tell me when I'm off the screen. So it come off my first horizontal strut. It's going to come forward, and then it's going to come up and it's going to engage my mid-buckle undercut. All right. So you want to make sure that all of these things are distinct. And I will review this in just a second, but for right now, let me kind of keep moving forward here. So the RPA, okay, you need to take a note of this. What makes the RPA design different than the cast circumferential is that these kind of look the same. If you look here, my retentive arm on my RPA and my retentive arm on my cast circumferential, they don't look too different. How do you tell them apart? So notice my little dotted line here. What makes the RPA drawing unique is that the entire retentive arm is below the survey line, okay? It doesn't approach from above and then the terminal third dips in. The entire retentive arm for the RPA is below the survey line, all right? So if you choose to do an RPA on the exam, you want to make sure that, and I think I have an RPA on these casts here. So here, now this one isn't quite as nicely drawn, but so here you can see there's my survey line on my drawing. we chose to do an RPA for number 11 because we had soft tissue undercut. So again, it comes off of the guide plate and the whole retentive arm, it's below the survey line and then engages the undercut, all right? So if you choose an RPA, you wanna make sure that it looks like an RPA. It should not look like a CC. It should not come from above the survey line and the terminal third engage and the whole thing is here. Now, the other unique thing about an RPA is that you don't need a reciprocating arm, okay? I just gave you a whole spiel about the importance of the reciprocating arm being that it resists the forces of the retentive arm to keep the tooth from moving orthodontically. So how do we do that with an RPA if we don't have a reciprocating arm? Well, the way that we do that is by bringing so this is a bad example because so with a canine, with the canine, we have our cingulum rest, we have our minor connector, which covers the cingulum rest, and then it all becomes one piece with the guide plate. So the canine's a little unique. Let's say that we were doing an RPA on this tooth, all right? So if I was doing an RPA over here, I'm gonna kind of just cheat for a second here, so we'll pretend. So here's my survey line, okay? And we're gonna talk about the rest in a second, but so my entire retentive arm stays below the survey line. I have to extend my guide plate past the distal lingual line angle. So that's how I get reciprocation with an RPA, is that the guide plane extends just slightly past the distal lingual line angle. So with an RPA, your reciprocation comes from the combination of the rest and the guide plate extending just past the distal lingual line angle. Okay, so you do have to remember that as well. Now let's kind of move to a rot here for just a second. Okay, so I've got a good example of a rot here. So a rot clasp is basically a wire. It's a rot wire. So it's a wire that's soldered onto the framework. So if you kind of look at this right here, you can see how this is like a wire which is almost sticking out in space a bit. You can see some kind of like dark charred area here. That's where this wire was soldered onto this framework. Today they'd probably laser weld instead of soldering. But it's a wire that is attached here to the framework, and then you can see it's like a separate piece. So a rot wire is not cast as part of the framework. A rot wire is added on after the framework is made to engage that undercut. So it's separate. So a rot wire is not part of the framework. If you look here, if I look at this cast circumferential clasp, it's all one piece. This is all cast as part of the framework. Here we have a rot on this framework design as well. This is not put on until the end. So you can see the wire is soldered on. It's a separate piece after this is made. A rot wire, because it's more flexible, does need O2O undercut. So the similarities are going to be that the rot also starts above the survey line with the terminal third engaging. So the rot and the cast circumferential are going to kind of look the same when it comes from it approaching above the undercut and then engaging the terminal third under the undercut. So those kind of look the same. Reciprocation with the cast circumferential is that you stay completely. So think about this. If that clasp arm goes underneath the survey line, it becomes retentive. All right. So as soon as you engage the undercut and dip into it, it becomes retention. So this is above the survey line. This is going to be your reciprocation. Reciprocation with your RPA is by extending the guide plate just past the distal lingual line angle. A rot wire is going to have reciprocation. So the rot wire is going to also have reciprocation by extending past the distal lingual line angle. Now this is where it might get a tiny bit confusing. You're going to wonder, well, what is a combination clasp? The combination clasp also has a rot wire. So I have a good example here of a combination clasp also. Oh, right here. Okay. So this is a combination clasp. So a couple things to talk about here. So if you guys are doing a distal extension, where were you taught to put the rest? For a distal extension, where does the rest go? Next to the edentulous space? Or does it go in the distal or the mesial? So let's say I'm going to take this off so you guys can't see. Okay, so if this is a distal extension, this is a mandibular. You could get something like this on the exam. Here's my distal extension. We talked about how we need a rest and a guide plane next to every edentulous space. So is my rest going to go next to the edentulous space, or is it going to go on the mesial? It's going to be the mesial. So write that down, okay? For a distal extension, your rest should go on the mesial. Do not do a distal rest on a distal extension. Big, huge no, no, no. Big X through it. No distal rest on a distal extension. I'll confuse you in just a second with this, but in general, your rest should go on the mesial, a guide plane on the distal, then you engage the undercut. The only design that you can do a distal rest on a distal extension is the combination class, okay? And I'm going to tell you why in a second. So this actually is a combination class, but in general, when you do your exam next week, unless you choose this combination class, with every other design, if it's a distal extension, the rest goes on the mesial. The rest does not go on the distal for a distal extension. This is a distal extension. This is a combination class. So let's talk about what makes this unique. You've got the rest on the distal, okay? You've got a wrought wire soldered on the buckle to give you your retention. And then look, we've got this little reciprocating arm here on the lingual. The reciprocating arm, guys, is part of the framework. So the reciprocating arm is cast as part of the overall framework. So when the framework is cast and the lab's ready to finish it up, this is all one piece. This little wire is soldered on at the end. So a combination clasp is a combination of a cast clasp and a rod. It's a combination. So our reciprocating arm is cast as part of the framework. Our retentive arm is soldered on. You guys with me so far? I know it's a lot, but I think it will hopefully help you to be ready for the test, I hope. Okay, so let's keep going here. So this is a really, really good thing to look at when it comes to studying. It gives you the illustrations, it gives you what they are, it gives you the advantages, what you use them for, and then the contraindications in the last column. So honestly, like this right here is going to be what you're going to use for all tooth-supported partials, for all Kennedy 3s. This is going to be what you're going to generally use for your distal extension. So these should be the things now, it's not that you can't use these for tooth-supported partials, but this is what you need to start with for your distal extensions. If you have a distal extension, such as this, such as this, okay, here's two distal extension partials. Your first choice should be I-bar, RPA, and then rods. Okay, that's going to be the order that you go in. Here, so let me go on to some other things here so I don't lose you. Okay, so let's go ahead here. Okay, I'm going to get to the major connectors in a second. So if we look here, let me pull up this example here. Let's see here. I'm not going to get into a brazier class. That's too much for you for right now. So here's one where we have a distal extension on one side, and we've got a tooth supported on the other. All right. So here you look, and this is a very difficult patient to treat. You can tell it's a really narrow arch, high palate, really, really constricted arch form. But principles are the same. So for our distal extension here, they chose to do a rot. All right. I would probably say a rot's always, there's a reason why a rot is way down here in the hierarchy. A rod is a wire. They aren't quite as retentive as a cast clasp. So if you have a situation where you need something to be more flexible, then a rod is a good choice. So let's say that you get a question such as your patient has a tooth that maybe has some periodontal involvement, or maybe the tooth had an endo and a root canal and it's a little bit weakened. Then a rod would be a good choice to use because it doesn't engage the tooth as much, it doesn't put quite as much, the forces are less. So a rod is good for something where you have concern about maybe some bone loss, some periodontal issues, possibly the tooth had an endo, maybe the tooth has slight mobility. So a rod is going to be more forgiving. So a rod's a good choice for that. They just aren't as retentive. So when you want to start off with the top and work your way down. So here we have a situation where we've got a lateral incisor. So lateral incisors are definitely not going to be as great an abutment tooth as a canine or a premolar or a molar. So maybe in this situation, so this is a rot, if you look here. So maybe in this situation, a rot clinically was a better choice because we're clasping a lateral incisor, and we want to be a little more kind to a lateral, which is not always a fantastic abutment tooth. Over here, we've got a cast circumferential on the tooth supported side. So we actually have we kind of have two cast circumferentials here. So this is tooth supported, a CC, and then we have a rot on this side. Okay, let me kind of keep moving here. Any questions? I mean, is there something I can clarify at this point as I kind of move forward? No? Clear as mud? So I hope it's a little more clear than mud. All right. So I've talked a little bit now about some principles of design. So we talked about how you need a rest and a proximal plate next to every dentulous space. We talked about how, in general, the rest and the guide plate are next to the dentulous space, but we talked about how with a distal extension, you would like your rest to be on the mesial. Except for when it's a canine, the rest is going to be a cingulum rest, so it doesn't have to be on the mesial. Here's a good example. So here is our RPA. So if you look here, we've got an RPI on this. So this is two distal extensions. This is a good example to look at. Two distal extensions. We've got an RPI and we've got an RPI. We've got our rest on the mesial, not on the distal. No distal rest on the distal extension. And on the canine, because we don't put a distal rest or mesial rest on a canine, it becomes a cingulum rest. So in our canine, we have a cingulum rest, which kind of connects with the proximal plate. It's all one piece. With our RPI on our premolar, we have a mesial rest, and then we have a distal proximal plate, and then our eye bar. Okay, so you want to make sure that you also on your exam next week, don't get messed up with this. You have to have a guide plate. A lot of times people just put a rest and they forget that the rest has to get up to the tooth from something. So that's where we have our guide plate, which brings the rest up to the tooth. If you just draw a rest and you don't put a guide plate, I guarantee you there's going to be a little slight deduction, because how does that rest get up there? It has to get up there from the framework somehow. So you want to make sure you don't have what we call those floating rests, a rest that just floats but isn't connected to the framework. Okay. Couple other things to look at here would be, this page here is all the major connectors. So we'll talk about major connectors in a second. So is your exam next week really just a mandibular for sure? You don't know? Have you done many maxillaries yet? Usually the first one's a mandibular. But I don't know that, so don't quote me on that. But I know, I bet at this point you haven't done many maxillaries. Did he tell you? Okay, we're going to check the syllabus, so I'm not giving you incorrect information. So it's on you. You're it. All right. Let's see if you can get in with the Wi-Fi.